reason to praise. We are redeemed and restored. You are the great liberator. You ransom us from our shame. Now by the love of the Savior, everything broken will change. Oh, this will be my year of victory. My chains are gone. Now I am free indeed. Every debt is paid by amazing grace. All that is left is to celebrate. Your love has won. I'm free indeed. My jubilee has come. Oh, has come. Slaves of the past, this is the year of the Lord. Here at the foot of the cross, we are outsiders of war. You made a way through the chaos into your marvelous light. You broke the bondage that held us. Now we are fully alive. Oh, this will be my year of victory. My chains are gone. Now I am free indeed. Every debt is paid by amazing grace. All that is left is to celebrate. Your love has won. I'm free indeed. My jubilee has come. Oh, my jubilee has come. You shook the walls of my prison. You brought me back from the grave. You turned my mourning to dancing. Into the night I proclaim that this will be my year of victory. My chains are gone. Now I am free indeed. Oh, this will be my year of victory. My chains are gone. Now I am free indeed. Every debt is paid by amazing grace. All that is left is to celebrate. Your love has won. I'm free indeed. My jubilee has come. My jubilee has come. My jubilee has come.
Oh my gosh, the Jubilee has come. Yes, yes, yes. Put some love in the chat. What an amazing opening to our Liberation Roundtable today. You just heard the song The Year of Victory performed by the Zao MKE band, and that song is originally by Rend Collective. Hey, I'm really excited that you're at this Liberation Roundtable, and I'm really excited to welcome up our guests, including our very first-timer guest. Before we get to that, I have some announcements for you. One, Liberation Project has dropped the Lenten series guide for this Lent. So if you want to follow along in a series in your church, there's a really high-quality liberation theology guide in the chat. Two, okay, Jonah and the Peacock. Have y'all been listening to Jonah and the Peacock? This podcast is on fire. Jonah and the Peacock is so, so amazing. It is one of the most amazing projects that have come out of the Liberation Project. So please do give Jonah and the Peacock the listen. And then our next roundtable is going to be on April 6th. So April 6th, just in time before Holy Week. Put it in your calendars. It'll be great. Before I introduce our panel, I also want to give a shout out to our behind the scenes team. Can we show lots of love in the chat for Sarah and Kyle and Austin, who are making all of this possible? Thank you so much for doing what you do. And now it is my honor to introduce each of the folks that we're going to be talking with tonight. Rockin' at Zao and wants change now, it's Cameron Overton. Loving on a baby, pronouns are them and they be. It's Jonah Overton, everyone. Show some love. Prof, Rev, and Doctor, you cannot say anything that shocks her. It's Jay Williams. Woo, woo. And last but not least, first-time guest, all the way from the Center for Prophetic Imagination. Buckle up for a capitalism bash. Their prophetic imagination will make the empire crash. It's Ash, everyone. Yes! Love this. And I am your humble facilitator for today, Tyler Sitt from New City Church, he, him pronouns. Thank you all. I love seeing the cheers in the chat. Definitely type in, where are you tuning in from across the country or around the world? We love hearing, where are you tuning in from today? Love to see that. So today we are talking about capitalism, and we have a lot of things to share. However, we also want to hear from you. So if you have any comments or questions, keep that going in the chat. Absolutely. Yeah, so we see folks coming in from Florida, from Salem, Oregon. I see you. Tuning in from Boston. Woo woo. Bloomington, Illinois, the place where dreams come true. I hear there's a really good drag scene there. Los Angeles, California. Hallelujah. Yes, yes, yes. Love this. So wherever you are coming from, we are so glad that you chose to spend your evening with us. So I want to jump right into this. We have lots to say, and we want to, again, see your comments as well. So first off, I just want to start a little bit bigger picture. How is capitalism anti-gospel? How does capitalism anti-gospel? Jay, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can definitely get started. Jay Williams, he, him, my pronouns, lead pastor of Union Church in Boston. Right, it's kind of been said that, right, gospel, good news, wherever it's preached, right, it's preached at the intersection of like scripture and what's happening in the world, right? So like we have to start, with what's happening in the world, in like front and center on the news, and the absolutely atrocious invasion of Ukraine by Russia, right? And the devastation that is being wrought against innocent people by a man who's propped up by power and military, and just this like complete corruption of what leadership looks like, what narratives look like. But like what I'm, as it relates to this topic, right, around capitalism, what I've been really like painfully wrestling with is like the sense of like, what can we do as 2 million people are, internally displaced, within Ukraine, into Poland, and right. So what is to be done, and the lack of options on the global field, the global plane, in order to respond. By that I mean, right, it seems like the international community, the only response that is being offered is, right, sanctions, a toppling of, right, the Russian economy in order to try to coerce some change of action from Putin, right, which at this point like has not worked. And the way in which this like war, right, the greatest devastation of Europe since World War II, comes down to like international oil prices, what's happening to the market in Russia, but global markets, and just the sinister way in which, right, evil perpetuates evil, and the only option, right, to try to end that evil is to wield the power of money, So I guess the question is, how is capitalism anti-gospel? Well, it has to start with the ways in which the devastation of the people of Ukraine and the lack of flourishing that is possible in that context because of the collusion of power and money and how that just devastates people, life, and the possibility for safety.
Jay, I think you make a really good point about all of that. And I want to talk more about what you brought up about sanctions, that under capitalism, we have this this manipulation of the feelings of war by making everything appear to be what it is not. So like, in like a true militarism kind of sense, just even the conversation we're having about a no-fly zone, right? Like we're talking about, oh, should there be a no-fly zone? Which is just euphemism for should we shoot Russian planes out of the sky? And so we can talk about engaging in war without calling it war. And that's especially true when it comes to economic warfare in the form of sanctions, because sanctions actually do the same thing that typical military warfare does. It devastates a country. It results in death and deprivation. It isolates and coerces a nation, right? And in the same way that we oppose war because it doesn't go after the despots and dictators and imperial oligarchs who are making these decisions. It goes against the people, the common people. The sanctions that are being levied against Russia are not impacting Putin, who is one of the richest men in the world. It's impacting regular working class Russian people. And I think that one of the evils of capitalism and one of the core tensions capitalism has with the Bible is that it does tend to obscure violence, that economic violence truly is violence and causes illness and famine and death and devastation in real physical material ways. But we get to pretend that we're not at war by calling it a sanction instead of a bombing. And I think that part of confronting capitalism's anti-gospel nature is really just getting real about how violent the movement or blockage of money can be in our world.
There's also this piece of, I mean, capitalism at the end of the day is about ownership and how we assign value to certain commodities and blah, blah, blah. And this sort of focus, with why we're focusing on Ukraine, for a lot of us, it's about the deprivations and violence against people. But the reason why it's coming to us and why our nations care about it is because of how it disrupts economic systems and sets of values. Like there's something strategically important and valuable about Ukraine. There's all sorts of reasons why we focus on Ukraine and our attention is being driven there, but not places like Yemen. And I'm not doing a what about it here. Like I'm not diminishing what's happening in Ukraine, but why is there attention there? And to me, the anti-gospel piece of it is that some people's lives are worth more than other people's lives in the capitalist system. And for reasons that are largely economic. And in the United States and other Western societies, we don't like saying out loud, those human beings are worth more than those other human beings. What we say is, this nation is we have to stand with these people in the name of freedom, but the people of Yemen somehow don't represent, for example, the values of freedom. And the underlying thing is that their sense of ownership and claim to this planet is just lesser than. And so there's this value thing going on. Like the gospel has a certain kinds of subversive understanding of who's most important in any given context, who's valued, who's loved. In our society, with its capitalist economics, reinforced by our violence, like you said, both by military violence, but then economic deprivation, values some people over others in ways that Jesus isn't down with.
Yeah, and this idea, yeah, thanks, Ash, right, in terms of like this, right, this gospel vision that we all might have abundant life, right, and that embedded in the war machine, both the military and economic war machine, is, right, a valuation, right, actually an economic term, to say, right, that some are worthy of saving, right, some are worthy of flourishing and others are not, and it goes even further, right, and like, so the choice of sanctions, and like the choice not to like implement a no-fly zone, or for like NATO to put boots on the ground, then falls back into a very straightforward articulation that we will not, NATO powers won't risk American lives, German lives, British lives, for this, for those people. So like there's so many layers of, right, this valuation of life, and not even to mention like the way in which like the refugee crisis that is being, right, created, like who gets to cross the border, like the way in which like skin color and nationality is like showing up even within, right, what is already known as like the worst humanitarian crisis of the last few years. So this system, this embedded like system of hierarchy and the valuation of lives that is somewhat obscured in this conversation of the war, can only really be interrogated most at its deepest level, I think, from a gospel orientation where all lives are valued as worthy of flourishing.
And back to that idea that capitalism obscures that process, because it's not a gun necessarily, not always a gun pointed at somebody, right? When capitalism is devaluing people and assets are being moved around in particular ways. The U.S. government has decided to freeze and seize all the foreign assets of Afghanistan, which is going to plunge 95% of the people of Afghanistan into poverty. And there's a prediction that millions of children will die in the next year. And that kind of devastation, we don't have the same kind of reaction to that. But it is literally saying, we're going to take these billions of dollars and divert it to America. Actually, like half of that money is going to Americans who are deemed more valuable and more worthy of life under this capitalist logic.
Well, I think that's really what, like, when you talk about the gospel, like, how more anti-gospel can it be than that, right? Like, you look back to Jesus and the building of the community and who he was building community with, and how then after Jesus, churches existed, right? Like, I just think like all of this, all of the ways in which I see our kind of modern church existing mimics what we are doing in the modern America, right? And so what does one do, and how does one have conversations about the gospel when you're not having conversations about economics, when you're not having conversations about what America is doing? Like what you just said, Jonah, like, my goodness, where is the church then to spread the good news? Like, what good news is it to those children if we can't have conversations about how we are to like push against systems that are devastating and killing, right? And because again, we have valued American lives at this moment more than Afghanistan children, right? And like, what is the church's responsibility to do something about that? That I think is part of the gospel. And for me, like, again, when you look back to the church after Jesus, how much communal living it was, right? Like the spreading, the sell your things, throw in together and do the thing. That's not capitalism, by the way. Like that is something else that we talk about, maybe like being socialist, which we don't want to ever talk about, because no, Jesus couldn't have been a socialist. And by the way, we're going to scare everybody because of those scary socialists and communists, which is why we hate Russia even more, which is why everyone's jumping on board and being, I stand with Ukraine, because it's Russia, right? And I literally today, I'm also a professor, and I was in a classroom, and some of the students said like, well, yeah, we have to be really scared of the Russians. So I think we should probably just like drop bombs on Russia, right? And I stopped and was like, wait a second, like all Russians aren't bad, right? Like we have a leader who has power because he has economics. You know, Jonah mentioned him being one of the richest people. So with riches comes power, and so you get to wield that power. And often, again, the best thing and the worst thing that capitalism does is switch that around and put that onus on the people, right? So now we're all against Russians, and that is not what we should be doing. And yet that's what capitalism does to us when we are not being thoughtful about what does actually this mean for our world.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. And I'm kind of curious, just play a little bit of devil's advocate here. So like buckle up, y'all. Like let's get into this. How do you respond to someone like my economics teacher in high school who's like, capitalism is fundamentally about competition and the idea that competition makes things better. If there are two people offering a product and one of them is able to create a better product, then we'll pay more for that or buy that instead of this. And doesn't that create better marketplaces? Doesn't that create better products? Sure, these international tragedies are hard, but like, is capitalism really to blame? Like, isn't capitalism just kind of about competition? How would you respond to that?
I mean, I'll jump in if nobody else, if folks want to gather their thoughts, I'll just, speak without thinking. I think part of it, like there are a lot of defenses of capitalism that are basically like, this is the worst bad thing. Like, in the comments, for instance, like I wouldn't expect any better of any worldly system. And I think that that's an extremely pessimistic view of the world. And I think that it's a pessimistic view of humanity. And I think that it's one that presupposes that we can't actually improve our creation and that we actually have to just wait to die and get to heaven. And I think that that's a gospel of death, not a gospel of life. I think that the eternal life that God promises us in Jesus, the kingdom that Jesus is preaching and teaching about, is one that comes to earth. And I think that God works with us to bring that into being, saying that the kingdom is already here and that the kingdom is in us. And I think that to throw in the towel and say like worldly systems are just going to be terrible, and so let's pick the least bad, the idea, for instance, that capitalism is the least bad system because it makes the most out of human greed and competition and contempt for the other is just a cynicism I'm not willing to buy into as a believer in Jesus Christ. And personally, as a Wesleyan, I do believe that we can strive towards perfection, and it is our moral and religious obligation to do so. I think that when we talk about alternatives to capitalism, a lot of the critique is like, well, there's the free rider problem or whatever. And one of the extremely funny responses to that I've seen probably on TikTok was basically like, okay, so your problem with socialism is that someone else is going to do all this hard work and make all this sacrifice, and that someone having done nothing to earn it could receive a benefit forever that really came from someone else's sacrifice. Oh, I'm sorry, and you're a Christian. So tell me about the Jesus Christ who died on the gospel and sacrificed or died on the cross and sacrificed his life so that you, a sinner, not deserving of grace, could live in eternity because of Christ's gift to you. Like, I believe that we are people of the cross and of the resurrection. And so in that humility to say, like, God has something better for us in store, and to bank not on our greed and our corruption, but on the promise of grace and abundance, that's the way of the gospel.
I mean, the idea of equal exchange between voluntary agents in a transaction, I mean, that's not capitalism. That's a market. And there are market forms of socialism. And so the idea of just collapsing it all down into like, people should be able to do what they want as long as they're not hurting anybody. That's all capitalism is it's one of the great myths that obscures reality. There's so many other things that what's happening with capitalism. It's the fact that like I can own a chunk of land in perpetuity and pass it on to my descendants forever, which is the logic of the aristocracy, and that most of the land outside of like Europe has been colonized, and somehow it's like we're going to believe in equality and democracy 1, 2, 3 now, like after conquest happens, and then there's like, and then you bring in Christianity. There's this weird thing of like, I believe in unmerited favor only in the spiritual abstracted realm. When it comes to the real world, I believe in merited favor. In fact, Jeff Bezos earned that more than any other person. He took on all the risks because a single mom working as a janitor doesn't take on any risks in order to live like Jeff Bezos did. Like all this sort of bullshitty stuff. It's like, you know what? I know we all regurgitate these myths anytime capitalism is threatened because it's what has been pushed into our brain. We have to stop and realize like capitalism is like 600 years old. Humanity, 100,000 to 2 million, depending on how you slice it. And there have been gift economies in different ways that people have shared resources. Like we just somehow act that human nature is boiled down to capitalism, and that Christianity has to make room for capitalism too, even with all that grace and jubilee bullshit. Like who do we serve? I mean, there's a reason Jesus said you can't serve God and mammon. And I think capitalism is on the mammon side of things.
And I love that point, because when you live on the margins, you don't actually benefit from that myth, right? So like gift economy, do you know how many queer people have families that are not their real families, who have had to like live lives of figuring out how to take care of one another? Or Black folk running around getting zero benefits from like capitalism because the white supremacy is hoarding all of the money. Like we've had to figure out how to live in different economies forever. Well, I guess maybe for 600 years at least, right? Because like we don't get those benefits. They aren't for us. Capitalism isn't here to like help out people on the margins. It's to hoard the money. And so like we've had to figure out how to do life differently, and we know how it is. And so when people are like, well, how do we do this differently? Listen to the people at the margins. They have had to figure it out.
Yeah, and like there's this one of the reasons why I feel like this conversation around like capitalism and gospel, or like broadly like economics and religion is like very valuable is because I think religion, particularly our Christianity and the way we tell a story, actually has very helpful resources to think about debunking the myths or the lies, right, that we have been told and that have been forced into us before we even were like conscious of them. And one of those, right, is this idea of like the free market, right, that has this omnipotent, omniscient power to like sort things out, right? And Harvey Cox, theologian, who a scholar of like Pentecostalism in particular, but also just like kind of public religion, wrote this article in the Atlantic in 1999 called like "The Market as God," where like he interrogates just the way in which like capitalism, capitalism actually capitalizes on a certain understanding, right, of religion that then makes it slightly palatable for those who are uncritical to like get in bed with it. In other words, like this idea that the market will sort things out and everything will be okay and the survival of the fittest. And it is a false copy of this idea that God will work things out and in the end everything will be okay. So just have faith and believe. But what we need to be doing, and I think this is what we're trying to do in these roundtables, is to actually pull back the certain civic religion, these tropes and ideas that just get tossed around, and say, actually, let's go back to the scriptures. Let's think a little bit more deeply about our own story as we try to re-narrate it and say, yes, Jesus talked a whole lot about money, and it was often very critical of the way in which some have and some don't. So the idea of the free market and capitalism is good for us, back to Tyler, your point, because people competition, well, it obscures the fact that major multinational corporations, that actually nothing is free, that there's a whole lot of decisions being made before things come to market. So if we think it's actually free, well, then we've all been kind of duped, and it's all actually kind of enslaved in a certain colonial these conglomerates where somebody is making the decisions, whether or not we know it or want to acknowledge it.
Right. Yeah. Whatever concept of free market that existed before certainly doesn't apply to the geoeconomic system where we have such an amazing concentration of wealth and so few people. Yeah, I think that's really good. That's good. And you mentioned scripture, Jay, and I just kind of want to pull a little bit more on this. We've talked about a couple of economic visions of the gospel-centered economic vision, but really, can you flesh that out a little bit more? Any of you, what does scripture say about economics, and how can we base our communities off of that? Yeah, go right in, Jonah.
All right. Well, so I think that there are a lot of folks who will argue, that the early church is proto-socialism, and then there are people who want to be really precise about that, who are actually socialism is a highly human construct that comes much later, and we shouldn't conflate them. And so I don't want to get into actual economic models, but I think that there are a couple things worth noting in scripture. One is a critique of certain economic building blocks that are fundamental to capitalism and to many other exploitive economic systems that we are warned against. So the usury is what it's called in the scriptures, but basically the charging of interest is named in the law as immoral and against the way of God. You've got the parables of Jesus repeatedly telling us that hoarding is bad, that having surplus is bad. And then you have the promises of what God's economy does offer. And one of the clearest ones from the beginning to the end of our scriptures, from the law and through the gospel and the letters from the church, is about debt, and saying that debt is fundamentally evil and that liberation is from debt. And that metaphor, it's not just a metaphor for sin, right? It is a recognition of the reality of the binds on our lives that economic debt holds, and that is ungodly, and that's not the way of the kingdom, that we need to be free from debt. So debt, interest, and hoarding surplus, those things are fundamental to capitalism. It's not fundamental only to capitalism, but the gospel is telling us that these things are anti-kingdom, anti-gospel. And so then not only can we extrapolate that generosity and freedom from debt and distribution of resources where they are needed, and trust in God's provision, like those things are all part of God's economy. But we also have these more positive examples of, God's economy is the economy of the household, which is non-competitive and abundant. And abundance is a theme as well, right? God's provision, God provides always enough. But only enough if we're not hoarding. And that's the thing, is that like our attempts to preserve, our attempts to ward off any future famine by mistrusting in God's abundance, it rots. And that's what we're taught by the scriptures. And so I think that God's economy is one of trust, one of provision, one of abundance, and certainly one where there is enough for all. And our failure to trust that is the basis of like every economic system that we've had, that's exploitative, that says there isn't going to be enough for everyone, therefore I'm going to make sure there's more than enough for me. And I think that that's the tension, is moving from that scarcity into the abundance and the promise of the gospel.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I was reading one scholar talk about in the mid 1900s in South America, folks who were the religious authorities were very careful to translate the Lord's Prayer as "forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us," instead of "forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," because there was fear that South Americans would rise up and demand an actual economic reform where people forgive debts. And they're like, well, that can't possibly be true. We can't possibly allow that. And I also, before I get to my next point, I saw in the chat that there's been some like sticking happening in Facebook in our live stream. Could you all just check in the chat? Like, are you with us? Is this still happening? Can you hear us? Yeah, but yeah, no, I think that the theme of debt, economic debt specifically, is really relevant as we live in a context where debt is spiraling to like heights that is astronomical and ruining people's lives. So yeah. Thanks for checking in, folks. I'm with you. That's good. And I love that if there isn't going to be enough for everyone, so I'm going to assure that there is more than enough for me. That kind of like the basis of this empire thought is this scarcity mindset that says fundamentally I cannot trust or bond or have relationship with anyone else, so I'm just going to kind of look out for myself. Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for checking in, folks. So yeah, Ash, do you want to go next? What do you think?
And there's that whole through line in the Hebrew scriptures that informs Jesus and then the apostles of the Jubilee, which, did they really do it? Like, what's the idea? But the idea that somehow God like set aside this land for a people that's apportioned by tribes, then clans, then family, and that every generation it reverts back to its ancestral like people, so that any debt that gathered would be cleared, including slavery debt of selling yourself to pay like into servitude. And then Jesus shows up and says, well, let's just do that all the time. Like, that's kind of one of the interpretations. That's the Luke Acts through line. And then the only time that I can tell, like, unless you talk about the book of Revelation, which is kind of trippy, that we have God murdering people in kind of this sort of like old-timey justice way, which is a complicated passage, is with Ananias and Sapphira, who wanted to hoard their wealth and lie about it. And, we can argue about whether it's the hoarding or the lying that's the big bad, but what happened is they preserved their own thing and kept it from community. They were living in violation of the principle of Jubilee. Later on we hear like, you shouldn't have no debts except for the debt to love one another. That's not like, we twist all this stuff opposite. We treat debt like it's the person who's in debt that's the moral failure in our society. But the reality was the other way around throughout all of fucking scripture, to the point that we even twist that passage as like, you should be virtuous and never take out debt. Well, no, there is no debt except for the debt to love one another. That's the gospel. And economics, if we can't do economics that way, then our church is Gnostic in the worst sense, not the cool, sexy sense of the word Gnostic.
Yeah, we all need a cool, sexy sense of Gnosticism in our. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's exactly right, though. I also love the shout out in the chat to the parable when the workers at the end of the day all get the same pay, regardless of how many hours they put in, because God was like, I get to decide how this gets distributed. I'm God. The whole point is that I made all the things. Like, this is all mine, and I get to choose. And God chooses again and again to distribute based off of love and flourishing of all of creation, and not just this kind of meritocracy of human rights.
Well, and I love that you brought that up because, that brings me back to something I was going to say earlier, was the question of like, well, what do we do when someone creates a better product than someone else, right? And what we've done is assign certain people higher value than others, right? And so that's a really good example where it's like everyone went in and worked and they gave what they had and they got the same thing, right? And so like in a different imagination of the world, that's something that Jesus was calling us to, and saying like everyone has the same value even though they give different things, right? And I think that if we were to have that kind of thought or imagination, our whole world would look different. We've had different roundtables, about how to include people or how to see people, you know, uh, as valuable as other people. Like last time it was around mental health and also neurodivergence, right? Like if we saw everyone as valued the same, and we found places in which they give, right, of to the community, because we all have things to give, they just look differently, and we all get what we need, right? And that I think is a perfect example of something that we could do, that a new thing could be here if we look to the gospel, in which we have examples.
Yeah, and I think that like a really fundamental thing that is at play here is, what does a win look like? And like the logic of capitalism is, a win looks like more money, and in the gospel, a win looks like a flourishing creation. And sometimes economists will equate those two things. Like they'll say that the GDP is an indicator of the flourishing of a country, but the GDP has very little to do about whether or not the gospel is being realized in the world, because it doesn't name how that wealth is being concentrated or distributed. And so we don't know which of the folks are still being chained in the graveyard and which of the folks are still going to the well at noon, because the economic system doesn't care about them. As we're kind of rounding the corner, I want to talk a little bit now about something a little bit more specific. We've been talking about bigger picture economics and scripture, but what does this actually look like on the ground? What are Lenten practices that we can use in this particular season to resist capitalism?
So I think I'm a big fan of creating small practices that shift your mindset, your paradigm, and the way that you critique and understand the world. And I think two that are really important to me, that I've been variously good or not good at implementing, are so one of them is, there's a lot of conversation about whether folks who are asking for money on the street should get money, or someone else should decide for them how they are to survive. And I think it's been a really good practice for me to give people money when they ask for money, to trust people, to believe people, to say what I'm giving you is access to choice in a world that dictates choice based on cash, and you deserve to live and you deserve to eat, and this is the only way that's going to happen. And I release my control over what you choose to do with your resources, and I'm going to do everything I can to resource you. And so, when I was living in Chicago, where there at most major like on-ramps to the highway, for instance, there was always somebody who was that was their spot. Or, you know, I had a neighbor who like lived on my block on the street. I always had cash, and it was a practice to give it away, to remember that like, this isn't mine either. But I think another one that has been helpful to me is about tipping. Tipping is a bullshit practice in capitalism, and we need to tip really aggressively all the time, because tipping is a way of employers saying, "Oh, I don't actually have to pay you a living wage. You're going to get a little performance evaluation every minute you're doing your job, and that's going to determine whether you can buy groceries at the end of the week." And it's a really bald example of the way of kind of what Cameron was talking about, where like, you know, the parable of the workers of the field, like we all deserve to eat. We all deserve healthcare. We all deserve a place to live. And those things should not be predicated on other people's valuation of our job performance. Like, I should be able to actually do a shitty job some days and still eat at the end of that day. And so practicing tipping really, really well, including when I get terrible service, is a material reminder to me that that our jobs and our payment and our income should not be based on anything other than we all deserve to live. And when you start to do that on a regular basis, it really makes you think differently about salaries in general, and benefits we provide to workers, and the right to a living wage, and, you know, why it doesn't matter whether you have an advanced degree in terms of how much of a right you have to live and go to the doctor. And, you know, so for me, those are two practices that just allow me to like hold my money a little bit more loosely, and remember that the constructions about who deserves money and under what circumstances are really garbage.
Yeah, and along with that, I think evaluating where our money goes, right? And who is benefiting from those things. So something that I talk a lot about in some of my classes, I'm in, you know, I'm in social work, and talk a lot about criminal justice world. And if you want, you know, who's benefiting from things like mass incarceration, right? And like the continuation of slavery and free labor. Like, mass incarceration equals slavery, just modern day. And so like, you can go ahead and Google like where and what corporations are using like slave labor, aka the mass incarceration system, to see which products you're using that do those things. And so I think that that's something that we should be thinking through, of like, you know, who's benefiting. And the whole idea of capitalism, because I don't think we've actually said this, is the fact that like there's 1% of the people who have most of the money, and the rest of us don't, right? So we're not talking about like being mad at your boss. We're not talking about that. We're talking about like this 1% that gets to make a lot of decisions for us because they hold all of the money. Those are the folks that we're talking about. And I think like often we get in these battles of like, well, you're kind of rich, but I'm poor, and you're this. But like, actually, we want to be talking about this top. And so who benefits? This 1%. Let's talk about which products we're putting our money in. And then the second thing around like Lenten practices is rest. I am really bad at this, like the worst, right? But I think when I think about capitalism and that grind that you have to be in, you have to perform, you have to work further, you have to put in 60 hours to get all of the things done that all of your employers are telling you have to have. It's that grind on your body and your soul, and that is killing us too. And so like a huge practice that I know, again, I'm preaching to myself here for a second, is to rest.
My brain's on fire, but I'll try to keep it brief. Like, I'm not from a Wesleyan type tradition. I'm an Anabaptist, and usually in these sorts of conversations, someone will pop up. Someone did in the comments, said that's for the kingdoms of the world. The church is is a counter society, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, let's just go there for a second. One of the ideas, this is the Lenten season, one of the ideas that kind of informs my understanding of Lent is this German idea that comes from the German mystics, Gelassenheit, which then influenced some of the early Anabaptists. It's letting go-edness or yieldedness. And there's Hans Hofner, one of the early Mennonites or Anabaptists, had this pamphlet called Concerning a True Soldier for Christ, where he says something to the effect of, may I give up for love's sake, Gelassenheit, for love's sake, even the things you have given me, O Lord. And to me, the thing is, like, if we're really gonna say, yeah, that stuff's for the world, capitalism talks for the world, the church is a counter society, then what does it look like for the church to actually redistribute its wealth? Like, how do we ask amongst ourselves how to practice Jubilee? Like, I'm not going to prescribe that. Like, that's complicated stuff, depending on how much money is floating around your church, like what your issues are, your struggles. But rarely do you find a church that actually opens up the conversation, because it's scary as hell, because churches rely on money. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to spook people off, you know? But how do we really talk about that and get to the point where people are sharing resources in some sort of gift economy? And then to challenge ourselves and say, okay, we're working on this. What does it mean for us to be prophetic? Can we take this and then say, like, if we have to say in the name of Jesus in front of it, that's fine. And say, like, how do we then challenge the principalities and powers of capitalism to say, you too should come forth and join us in this gift economy, instead of what ends up happening, which is like this sort of weird two kingdoms theology, where then the church actually doesn't do much different except for it has a soup kitchen sometimes, which is good. But is that gospel? To me, that's like keeping people alive until they hear the gospel. And the gospel is gift economy, radical abundance. May I give up for love's sake, even the things you've given me, O Lord.
Yeah, and like one of the things that's often tossed around in like Methodist circles, one of Wesley's, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can, right? And like, to what extent is that actually practiced in Lent or outside of Lent by like any church, where like, I mean, of course it does participate in the system of like earning. So there is a challenge that could be made there. But even if you consider yourself like stuck within that, you still do have a choice on how do you use like what you do have. And and often it just gets like reduced to like a simple rhetoric. Oh, it's a good principle, but never embodied in a practice. And like that's where like Lent like becomes interesting, right? And for the last couple of years, particularly during the pandemic, I've been inviting Union, the pastors, and I have been other pastors on staff as well, have been inviting Union to say like we've already lost so much, like has been taken away from us. What does it mean to like lean into a gospel sense of abundance? In other words, like instead of giving up chocolate or meat or whatever the case is, like how do I adopt? I take on a practice that contributes to my celebrating abundance and fullness and flourishing. So there is this way in which to practice Lent is to can be a way to practice Lent as it relates to economics, is to say, yeah, everybody deserves an abundant life, an abundant flourishing, and that there actually is enough to go around. So like unwittingly, sometimes this like scarcity mentality of Lent perpetuates a scarcity mentality of the world, that the reason why there's some on the top and some on the bottom, or is because there's not enough, which is just a fundamentally like wrong reading of everything that there is. The problem is not the amount. The problem is that there's greed, back to Jonah's point, and that we've been convinced that some people get to hoard it. So even beyond like the gospel, like that takes us back to, right, the wilderness of Lent, when this idea that, yeah, the manna that is hoarded does not last through the night. And, so like all the way through the biblical witness is to say, like, yeah, there's enough to go around if you trust that there's enough to go around.
Well, and that trust, that mindset that you're talking about, Jay, that's fundamental. This is why, like, Ash, I loved what you were saying about the gift economy, and I think that it's a shift of the heart as well as practice. But that's why I think that I in notes, right? I'm seeing Kyle really helpfully like document like their suggested practices, and I'm seeing my suggestions of like give to people who ask, tip really well, and like there are certain contexts in which those are just really bullshit suggestions for how to like be the least bad capitalist. Sort of, Ash, like you were saying about soup kitchens, right? That like sure, like charity is good, give to people who ask, be a good tipper, but like that's that heart change. It's that belief in abundance and belief in enough that actually shifts things in really radical ways. So when we talk about gift economy, there are two things that come to mind. One for me is Standing Rock. When I was at Standing Rock, similar to Occupy and other things that have sprung up out of necessity, but from a place of radical abundance and radical politics, there's this whole mini economy that's built up with that is gift. People send their gifts, people come with gifts, they cook for one another. We organize closets of everything everyone has brought, and you move through the space and you take what you need and you offer what you have. And at some level, it's just a big ass soup kitchen and clothing closet, but it's not charity, it's gift. And similarly, over the summer of 2020, when there was an uprising in the streets across the country, this country especially, but in some places across the world, and in my hometown of Milwaukee, we knew that one of the needs that was emerging was material support for people in the streets. And support was pouring in. People were gifting the movement and the protesters all sorts of physical material abundance. And so we housed that at our church. It's still running now. It's called The Depot. And it's this, it's the largest supply drop and distribution center for protest work in the state of Wisconsin, where people will call out what they need. People will bring what they have, and it's housed there. And one of the things that's so interesting to me is that when we tell people, like people will come through and they'll start kind of taking stuff and sort of hoarding stuff a little bit. And then they'll say like, how much of this can I take? And then when we say like, oh, this is already yours. Like this is here, it's been given to you and anyone who might need it. And like, you can take everything you need. What we see is people putting shit back. What we see is people reevaluating what they need, knowing that the rest of it is A, going to go to other people who need it, and B, going to be there for them when they need it. And so it's like I feel like our economy is just like a large scale toilet paper rush during, early COVID. And what God is calling us to do is like mellow out and trust in one another and in God's provision, and say like, actually, there's enough gifts to go around. And so for me, that's why these small practices that could be just sort of nice charity can be radicalized when we think about divesting ourselves from that toilet paper rush, divesting ourselves from the greed and scarcity, and saying like, oh, there's an abundance. I have a thing and someone else needs it. Or like, oh, there's an abundance. Everyone around me deserves to live, whether or not they earned it. And whenever I engage in a transaction, I can be invited to remember God's abundance, the value of all people, and the radical economy of the gospel.
And what I love about those examples, Jonah, of Standing Rock, and is that it undoes one of the main myths of capitalism that ironically funds toxic charity. The main myths of capitalism is being not only are the poor useless, but the poor are helpless. That somehow the poor can't contribute anything. The poor can't be leaders. The poor can't take care of other people. And therefore, the charity model is like all the people with all the solutions get to dump on all the people who have all the problems. And that's like a relief of guilt, but it's not actually like recognizing the imago Dei, like the the personhood of the poor. And so, in response to that, one of the things that my church has done is establish a microloan program where basically, like, the church poured into this amount of money, and anyone in the community can fill out like the simplest form for up to $500. And part of it is like describing the relationship with the community. We have a little advisory board that just makes sure that no one is like scamming us, and then we give them money at no interest, and there's no penalty if they don't get it back. If they don't give it back. And the invitation is like, hey, we're giving you this money. If you pay it back, we'll be able to give that money to more people, and you'll be able to like pay it forward and bless someone in that way. But also, we know that sometimes the turnaround is in 6 months for changing your economic situation. So trying to like give people, like, trust people with the leeway, and also say like, you aren't just a victim, and you aren't just someone who can only receive the benevolence of other people, and you're powerless. Like, you are powerful because you can bless the next person just like this fund had blessed you. And so that's just like one of the tactics that actually has worked really well. Like, people, just today, someone paid back their microloan because their job situation turned around. And it's not a perfect program, but it is starting to slowly retrain people to think differently about need and think differently about abundance. And that's kind of our goal. Yeah, I love, thank you all for attending this roundtable. I would love for you to put in the chat. I love seeing these highlights. What is your takeaway from today? What is something that you're going to continue to meditate on or ponder on? Put that in the chat. That'll be really helpful for us. And while you're putting that in the chat, I just have a couple of those announcements. The Lent series that Liberation Project put out is available on our website for how much? For free. Because we believe in it. It's a gift economy, sermon series gift economy. So, so please do check that out. It's really good. Speaking of things that are really good, Jonah and the Peacock podcast drops every Thursday. It is worth a listen. Season 1 is now fully right, Jonah? Season 1 is now fully available. Oh my gosh. You get to just like listen nonstop to amazing theology, amazing biblical analysis from people who care about liberation theology. Oh, what could be better? And lastly, our next roundtable date is going to be April 6th. So this will be right in time before Holy Week. So please do type it in. We are going to be, like the tag says, we're going to be talking about evangelism and just what is a liberationist approach to spreading some good news. So we're going to talk about this. Thank you all so much for being part of the Liberation Project. Keep in touch in our Liberation Project Facebook group. We have a mailing list, and we just want to hear your voice as well. So keep in touch. God bless you. And thanks again to all of our panelists. Bye, everyone.